It's been 80 years since the end of the Second World War, yet the shadow of that conflict still looms large over the culture and politics of the United States. Across the political aisle, people keep reaching for the language of the 1940s, describing their opponents as fascists and Nazis. More broadly, the post-World War II era has created a powerful mythos that still shapes our culture in books, movies, TV shows, and video games. This is especially true of science fiction. From Star Wars to Starship Troopers, there's a familiar visual vocabulary drawn from the struggle against totalitarianism, jackbooted soldiers, mass rallies, and militarized societies. But what does this mythology do to our politics and our sense of history? How has it shaped the way we see the world? And as the last generations with living memories of the war pass away, will this mythos fade as well? Or will it evolve into something new? I'm Djene and Patrick.
And I'm Patrick Needham, and this is Talking History.
To help us unpack the World War II mythos, we're joined by Matt Pearce, better known as the Feral Historian, who recently published a video essay on YouTube entitled Sci-Fi, Satire, and the Post-World War II Mythos. A Detroit native, Matt spent several years working as a draftsman before pursuing a degree in history. He went on to teach high school in Detroit, then entered a PhD program focusing on World War II and the early Cold War era. He eventually left academia, moving out west, and now explores how history is remembered and reimagined through science fiction while wandering the Black Hills. His YouTube channel, The Feral Historian, where he regularly publishes video essays that discuss the intersection between history and popular culture, is approaching 100,000 subscribers. Matt, aka The Feral Historian, welcome to Talking History.
Thanks for having me.
Matt, let's start with a recent video essay where you discussed two pieces of media, both the movie Starship Troopers from 1997 and the recent video game Helldivers 2. You argue that fascism has become mostly a visual and stylistic shorthand. Fascism is a hat. What do you mean by this? And perhaps more specifically, what is this post-World War II mythos? And connected to that, how is that distinguished from what we might call the actual existing fascism of the past, the historical Nazism?
Okay, starting with a big multifaceted one here, so feel free to interrupt me at any point. I think we really have to go back to the origins of fascism in the 1920s and 30s. And, I'm using fascism very broadly here, including Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and, all these spin-off movements. So we kind of start with the turmoil at the end of the Great War. There's territories have changed hands in some cases. You have governments that have changed significantly, most notably in Germany, where the system of government changed. The Kaiser's out, you had a series of little communist revolutions, and then that finally kind of settles in. And you have by the time you're getting into the 30s, the Great Depression sitting in, and all of this together, it's starting to look like the old ways of doing things are falling apart, and radicalism becomes very appealing. You start to get a lot of these communist movements in Germany in the aftermath of the war. In 1919 especially, you have a whole bunch of these communist uprisings and little short-lived republics popping up and whatnot. Similar things happening in Italy. And there's a lot of downsides with the communism that was being enacted then, but one of the things on the cultural side that I don't think really gets enough attention is that central idea of internationalism wasn't working for a lot of people. And so with fascism and National Socialism, it's not just this kind of co-opting the traditionalist motivations and kind of appealing to this return to order, but also I think it presented an alternative nationalist sort of radicalism, bringing this mythic element into it. And I think it's also, this is me going a little bit, into my own theorizing here, that it's a bit of a pushback against strict materialism, particularly if you look at the occult elements and some of the Nazi weirdness. I don't think it was just them being nuts. It was grappling with a sense that the world isn't just economics and class antagonisms and the kind of things that the communists were really kind of pushing with their ideologies. So you have this focus on culture as kind of a central pillar of it, and whether that was formulated in terms of racial qualities, that blood and soil idea that the people in the land are somehow linked. There's a peculiar kind of spiritualism almost to it that the Marxist movements explicitly lacked, and the broadly defined fascist movements were kind of able to move into that gap there. And I think once we keep that in mind, that there's always this mythic non-material element to it, says something about why it's managed to endure as this villain archetype throughout our media ever since. And part of its success is probably that when you couple that with the fact that fascist movements were responding to a lot of the same conditions that the socialists were, and in many of the same ways, in the sense of advocating for stronger state control, kind of a totalitarianism, these radical new ways of doing things, they're both responding to this idea that things are not working the way they used to and we have to try something new. So they took these technocratic ideas from the early 20th century, Taylorist scientific management and eugenics and all these sort of scientific or pseudoscientific ways of looking at things, and blending it with this almost atavistic sort of nationalism that's derived from culture, more in the case of Italy, or blood in the German case, rather than this, it's a different kind of nationalism than we think of when we're talking about the Westphalian nation state, where it's borders and flags and systems of government and all this. It's a much older and more visceral idea of what the nation is. And so then we get into this post-World War II mythos, because the war killed fascism. It's that particular branch of political development is completely discredited. It's not going anywhere. Done. End of line. Not because it's necessarily worse than, say, Marxist, Leninist, or Maoist systems or absolute monarchies, but it brought a lot of pain and then it lost. So it doesn't get to reinvent itself like some of those other ideas do. But that ghost is kind of lingering there as a perpetual wartime enemy, because they made a very good one. And even as the Cold War gets going, that fascist archetype doesn't really go away, in part, I think, because it's a lot more flexible with stories when you aren't doing a straight stand-in for the enemy of the day. We had plenty of movies set in the Cold War with the Russians as the bad guys, but it's kind of limiting. You can't really expand that out in quite the same way that you can with this mythologized villain archetype that no longer actually exists in the world.
So just to kind of follow up on that question, so in terms of this post-World War II mythos of fascism, in what sense does it kind of, and you kind of make this argument in the video essay, kind of become detached from that reality of actual existing fascism in the world? I mean, I think one of the emphasis you have is it becomes devoid of ideology and becomes more of an aesthetic or a visual style of understanding things. What's the kind of impact of that? What's the meaning of that? Why do we still, let's say, react to this visual language that you can see, especially in science fiction television or science fiction movies, of mass rallies, of the black uniforms, the Hugo Boss style uniforms, the kind of symbols, and you see this all over the world. But I think one of the cases you're making, that's kind of being completely detached from what fascism actually was historically. Why do we do that? Why do films do that?
I mean, part of it is just the visual style, that there's a certain attraction to it just on that level, but also it's representative of a very refined rather than straight up brutish kind of menace, making them the perfect bad guys. It's even when they first start using this Nazi archetype in science fiction, I'm not quite sure when the earliest point was. By the 60s, it was really getting underway. And then when I was a kid in the late 70s and 80s, it was a constant thing. It's Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica and all these things. You always had the space Nazis showing up. And it's because of that blending of the historical influence, the stylistic side of it, it's like the darkest iteration of civilization. It's a very refined, very technically adept, and yet they're reveling in this extreme but precise kind of brutality. It's very different than, if you look at the original Star Trek, the Klingons were basically space Mongols and with starships,
Mm-hmm.
having this kind of fascist archetype. It's a much more precise, much more scientific, much more orderly thing, and that somehow makes it more frightening than, say, giving orcs machine guns, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So you emphasize particularly that, in contrast to the mythology that we have today about fascism, that fascist regimes weren't Mordor, to use the Lord of the Rings vocabulary. In reality, people worked, people raised kids, people enjoyed ordinary life. Moreover, you point out that regimes like Nazi Germany could be viewed not as some kind of singular evil, but a more extreme manifestation of kind of general tendencies in European politics at the time. I think many people might find that perspective alien or even controversial. Why is it important to highlight that point as a corrective?
I think a big part of it is just the Hannah Arendt banality of evil aspect of it. It's horrifying in large part because it was ordinary people that did these things. And as soon as we detach the historical events from that idea and turn them into orcs, we start to lose that awareness that under the right conditions, it could be me. And that's, I think, when it's easiest for people to start down that road, when you've already separated yourself from that historical precedent and you've convinced yourself that, well, no, I'm different than those people because those people were really messed up evil psychos.
So the mythology that we're kind of talking about here, because it's detaching, actual fascism from the imagery of fascism, it kind of allows people to view fascism as a kind of sui generis evil done by evil people, done by maniacs, when in fact, fascism, as you point out, as Hannah Arendt has pointed out, this is actually just normal people justifying things to themselves, as opposed to kind of these particularly sociopathic or evil people doing nasty things that normal people, normal citizens wouldn't do.
Yeah, I think if you really get down to the core of it, it comes down to not so much fascism as just the idea that any kind of governmental system is a lever. It's a way that people can exert force on other people in a much more amplified and focused way than they would ever be able to do by themselves. And the more authoritarian and centralized the system is, the more leverage they have. And fascism was just extremely good at leveraging that kind of force at a society-wide level, which also makes it a very good template for science fiction bad guys, because that's usually what you're looking for. You want to have a galaxy-spanning epic with one really evil guy there that you have to defeat to win the day and set everything right. So it's just on that mythic level, it really works well.
In your essay, you discuss another piece of media that's pretty popular lately, and that's the TV series Andor, which is a Star Wars series. And it's read in the popular culture kind of as this anti-fascist allegory. And maybe more importantly, thought of kind of as a liberal narrative of struggle directed against fascist regime, or that mythologized fascism at least. And it also kind of explores this relationship between, more pragmatic institutionalists, the Mon Mothma senator kind of working behind the scenes, and your more hardline radicals working on the ground doing more controversial or violent actions. But you highlight the fact that Andor has been taken up by liberals in recent protest movements as a kind of cultural shorthand for resistance. Could you expound a bit upon your counterintuitive reading of that kind of cultural appropriation, that appropriation of a pop cultural item like that? When you compare like the setup for the massacre scene in the most recent season of that series, you compare it to the actions of January 6th and kind of the machinations around how that happened. Could you expound upon that a little bit?
Yeah, that stirred some things up. Well, part of it is that with some of these videos, there is a little bit of a social experiment aspect to it, kind of wanting to see how people respond in terms of how politicized contemporary, or how polarized contemporary politics has become. That there's a lot of not so much thinking about issues or responding to specific events and conditions, but cheerleading for your preferred team, which I think really muddles things. And part of why I brought January 6th in there was to kind of confront people with that and make them stop and kind of think about it. But kind of getting back more directly to your question, I did think it was interesting that you can look at it not only in terms of, I mean, there's January 6th, but you also have the Maidan uprisings in Ukraine. It's a similar kind of a thing where you have a lot of confusing events, a lot of different interpretations of them. Nobody really knows what's happening, but everybody has their theories that serve their own positions. And it's only afterwards, usually years after the fact, that you start getting more and more pieces of it and you're able to put the puzzle together. In both cases, especially with January 6th, I think right now we have a lot more pieces than we did at the time, but things still don't quite fit. People are always asking me ever since I did that video, it's like, well, what do you think happened? Why are you spreading these conspiracy theories? And it's like, well, I'm not pushing a particular narrative because I don't know. I'm just pointing out some things that don't fit the narrative that was being told on cable news for 4 years straight, because something doesn't quite add up. And we get a lot of that. It's not just that event. There's a lot of things in modern politics. And I think Andor really spoke to that well with the whole Gorman massacre buildup, that if you're looking at things from different perspectives, it's very easy to accept the narratives. If you're looking at Cyril Karn's perspective, for example, he's just there doing a job. He's a bureaucrat. He's trying to administer things. He's actually trying to diffuse the situation with the budding rebellion there. He's the good guy in his own mind, and he's making logical decisions with the information he has. The same is true with the protesters that went out there. They thought that they were making a statement and that it was going to be a peaceful way to get the Imperials to back down, not realizing that the whole thing was being maneuvered at higher levels and everybody was being put in exactly the positions they wanted to be because they were so caught in their own perspective, their own grievances, that they were unable to kind of step back, take a wider view of what's happening, think things through more than one step ahead, which, if people take one thing from my whole digression into Andor, I would call it a win if it's that. Just that little awareness that maybe step out of the bubble, maybe step into somebody else's bubble for a minute or two just to kind of see what they're saying and what they're thinking about, because that can be incredibly enlightening from time to time. And yeah, I suppose really that's my key point there is modern politics is a mess. Andor did a great job of visualizing that, and it's always good to try to see where the other guy's coming from.
So you argue that terms like Nazi, fascist, and racist have been overused to the point of losing their impact, and you connect this to this kind of post-World War II mythology. In your view, what should we call sort of genuinely, let's say, neo-fascist movements or explicitly racist movements today? What vocabulary is left for us that still has a moral or political force? I mean, the power of the Nazi and fascist vocabulary is that it's not just an analytical tool, but it's a kind of a moral condemnation of a political movement. So how do we navigate, in your opinion, that kind of difficulty when, of course, in the United States today, everybody, on both sides of the political aisle often use this very hot rhetoric to do with fascism and Nazism. And it's not just in the United States. In Britain, you had the whole debate around Brexit, where, the European Union was sort of portrayed implicitly and sometimes explicitly as the new Nazis, and the people who wanted to leave the European Union were kind of fighting the Blitz 1940 all over again. So, obviously that language is a little bit hot to describe a kind of bureaucratic fight between who gets to make the laws pertaining to bananas and what can be sold in shops. But, how do we navigate this? Are these terms like Nazi, fascist, racist, are they even useful anymore in our daily political vocabulary, or have they lost that impact precisely because they've become so generic with this post-World War II mythology?
Yeah, that's kind of the problem, is that they're overused precisely because they conjure up all these visions of forced labor and death camps, and it's like very powerful gut punch stuff. So it's probably inevitable that when people have very strong passions about things, that they're going to invoke those for their enemies, which, when done over the course of decades, leads us to where we are now, where it's, every once in a while there are some genuine neo-Nazis that need to be called out, but it's, the boy who cried fascist at this point, where it's like, oh, not again, really? It's somebody who's moderately right of center talking about immigration, for example. It's just like, it becomes very, very wearying. And I don't have an easy answer for what we should really do about that, because I think it's just the way that terminology like that works. If you have something that is very powerful, very effective, it's just by nature of that going to end up being overused, and you're going to get to a point where it still has that emotional resonance, but people become so fatigued by it that it no longer has the impact. It's just this grinding mess that gets added to the general political discourse that a lot of people tune out of.
So how then do you square the circle of, I mean, you described fascism as not being Mordor, as not being a singular evil, as being an extreme position of existing political mores. If that's true, then Nazi and fascism are just descriptors. They're not. Why does it matter that it's lost its emotional charge? Shouldn't it lose its emotional charge? Shouldn't we be talking about these things in rational, frank terms?
As a historian, I absolutely think so. And I think we're finally getting to that point now where we can actually start having those conversations in a much more detached, analytical sort of way, which I think is going to be a good thing going forward.
To be honest, it kind of undermines the whole premise of your argument here, though. The mythos is built up to be, I guess, maybe it doesn't. Maybe I'm just confused. Walk me through why it matters that we use this shorthand to talk about movements that in ways mirror the past. Of course, they're not one-to-one. That's why we call them shorthands. That's why it's allegory. That's the whole point of the literary canon is of course not to depict things as they are, but as to explain them. So why is it bad that we call something that looks like a fascist and quacks like a fascist in 2025?
I think there's two separate questions here. There's the historical study of fascism or Nazism or any of its spin-off movements as a historical event, which requires some detachment from it. And then there's also the cultural perception of it, which is increasingly a distinctly different thing. And that's really kind of where my focus is, this idea of what a fascist is. And that has become extremely watered down in political discourse from overuse. It's still a powerful cultural archetype. That's like why we still keep having that. It come up in different forms throughout our media, although it's becoming increasingly cartoonish in a lot of cases. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing that it's fading out. It's what happens with any kind of warmongering tyrannical movements. Nobody gets that angry, visceral reaction when you compare somebody to Napoleon anymore. It's kind of just like, okay, but you go back far enough. So I don't know if there's really a contradiction there. It's just two different aspects of the same. Like, you have the historical side of it and you have the cultural side of it. And you always have that bifurcation whenever there's any kind of a traumatic historical event. It kind of echoes on in this cultural distortion of it for a few generations afterwards. It's probably for the best that,
with all due respect, we're not talking about Sid Vicious wearing a swastika in 1978 or whatever. We're talking about Paul Ingrassia, a member of this administration, sending text messages about how much he loves Hitler. Like, these are not complete abstractions.
No, and I'm not defending it.
So one of the points that you bring up as one of the works that you think does a good job of looking at the sort of connections between Nazism and contemporary propaganda and politics is the movie Iron Skies, which people may not have seen before. It was an independent movie, basically a comedy, where you have moon Nazis, the classic trope of the moon Nazis coming back to Earth, to a United States run by a parody of Sarah Palin, doing the kind of mass politics that we see today. So, what specifically do you think that, that movie especially gets right in terms of Nazism and space Nazi satire that perhaps other movies don't quite get with their depictions of fascism?
Iron Sky is one of the few that satirizes Nazis for Nazi things. A great example is that scene where Klaus is sort of proposing to Renata, and he shows up with this Mendelian gene chart to show how compatible they are and how ideally Aryan their children would be. The film's full of these kind of, like, you're poking fun directly at the ideologies, the ideology of National Socialism. Another example, you've got the Moon Führer there. Like, every time somebody salutes and throws out a Heil Hitler, he just gets really fuming about it because they're saluting this mythical figure that's not there anymore. And instead of, like, he feels like he's the one that should be saluted as the actual sovereign running the place at the time. So instead of having this, these are the bad guys because they're Nazis, it's got this extra layer of, these guys are Nazis, they're scary, but they're also kind of ridiculous. And it runs with that as the root of its comedy, which I think that's why it works well, and it's sorely needed in a lot of ways, I think. I think that's why people keep watching that film. It kind of endures.
So it kind of points to the absurdity of fascism as well as its kind of sinister aspects as well.
Yeah, it's making light of it without denying what it is.
So as a kind of final question on this point then, you speculate about what might replace the Nazi archetype in science fiction as the kind of central boogeyman going forwards. We talked about at the beginning, we have the generation that witnessed World War II directly is dying off. Even the children now, it's 80 years going. And, you mentioned earlier, there's a kind of echo in historical memory. As you point out, you go back to the 19th century, and to call someone a Napoleon was, a great political slur from many on the liberal or even conservative elements of European society. And, perhaps something similar is happening today. If you were, let's say, talking to a science fiction writer today, what kind of new villain or power structure would you tell them to explore in, looking at our post-World War II, post-Cold War, and post-World War II mythology era as we go forward? What are going to be these kind of new tropes that we look at? And are there perhaps any genres of science fiction that you think are already doing this? I mean, it comes to mind perhaps the cyberpunk genre, where you have this, corporate-dominated world, things like, let's say, the new Aliens TV series where, the big bads aren't fascists anymore. They're business conglomerates. Even the new Fallout TV series, you have this kind of image. Is that the direction we're going? Because that's more relevant to a new generation who doesn't have that mythology in them?
One thing that I've been kind of thinking about recently with that is I've seen a lot of people point to China as kind of being the new archetype, but they're thinking of it in this return to the Buck Rogers Yellow Peril kind of thing. And I don't think that's really what it is. More what I think has potential for being a next stage science fiction villain comes to that idea of differences in civilizational memory. And a good example of it is the Three Body Problem series. I think it was the third book in that one that they had the deterrence era with this species from Alpha Centauri that wants to take our planet because theirs is terribly unstable orbit. And they tried a direct invasion, but a method of deterring it was devised. And so they've had generations of this stalemate. And during that time, this civilization changes their tactics and they start playing like they're our friends now. And there's a little bit of cultural exchange. There's a little bit of scientific exchange. And they just let this idea of we're going to come and take your planet just fade off into the background until the very moment when the deterrence breaks, and then they pounce without hesitation, because they had this very long-term, multi-generational view. And in America specifically, we don't really do that kind of long-term planning on that multi-generational strategic level, which I think makes it that concept an element of alienness that can really be brought into science fiction as an enemy that we can understand, but comes at us in a way that we don't naturally think about. Part of it is cultural, of course, and part of it is that our economic incentives tend to skew toward short term. But this implacable, patient adversary can be almost Lovecraftian in the sense that we aren't thinking on the same time scales that it is.
So it's a kind of can become a kind of critique of the short-termism of American society, not just politics, but the fast fashion, the quick materialism, and the fact that people don't look towards the future long term, even in terms of the environmental consequences as well, as opposed to a civilization that might kind of be thinking in a long-term way that we are just not capable of doing as a species or a society.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily strictly left or right coded, because you can make that same kind of argument about issues across the spectrum, saying, well, if we're looking at this from a multi-generational long-term concept, you could be talking about you critiquing capitalism, or talking about environmental issues, or talking about immigration issues. There's all sorts of different angles that you can come at it with that is one of the things that really makes a core idea something that can endure throughout several generations of storytelling.
Matthew Pierce, the feral historian, thank you so much. That's all we have time for this month. But
thank you for joining us.
No, glad to be here. Thanks.
You can catch this episode as well as our entire back catalog at ksmu.org or wherever you download your podcasts.